That was a very nice introduction. What Dan leaves out about my choice of an academic career was that, you know, the work that all of you do and the work of your union members, man, that is really hard. And I didn't want to work that hard. So I grew up in a steel family in a steel town in Youngstown, Ohio, and I had an opportunity to spend some summers working in a manufacturing facility, and I saw how hard my father, my mother, and families in that community worked, and how essential the United Steelworkers and the labor movement was to creating an opportunity for me to go to college. In fact, to go to college over and over and over again. I got to a point where, when I told my working class, still working father that I was going to go to school one more time, just one more time, Dad, to get a PhD, he responded, "Just how many mother effing degrees do you need to get a job?" Is that the first time somebody in a CISCO meeting said something like that? I haven't quite completely lost that working class experience. It's great to be here. I want to thank Dan and CISCO for inviting me back to talk about some current and I think some rather important research that we've just published. I've had a relationship with CISCO and many of the people in this room for a lot of years. And you've honored me by continuing to take my phone calls and to acknowledge me when you see me on the street. So thank you all. So my objective here today, because you have a lot of work to do, we had a whole table of really like good-looking people who are winning lots of awards. That's a heck of a crowd over there, and I know you have a lot to do. So my goal is to be brief and at the same time say something about prevailing wage and right to work that's worth repeating. So, real quickly, what we've got here is 2 studies. So I boiled this down to about 14 PowerPoint slides of 2 rather extensive studies. And these are 2 studies unlike any other studies that have been done anywhere before in any academic setting. The typical studies that are done on prevailing wage and right to work look at a situation where a state had a prevailing wage law and then weakened it and then evaluated, well, how did it turn out? Or they weren't right to work and then they were right to work, or like Indiana, they weren't right to work and then they are right to work. And then they look at the impacts and then they compare the before and after. You follow me? So that's how that's in fact how all the research has been done until now. So Illinois has never been right to work. That was like not my work. Right. And if you look at a map around Illinois, it should be very revealing what's going on around Illinois. Illinois has always had a strong prevailing wage law. In fact, it's only gotten stronger. It's never gotten weaker. So we don't have a situation where I can say, well, let's look at a period of time when Illinois had a strong prevailing wage law, but then it was weakened. Now let's look at the impact. Was it good? Was it bad? We don't have that. I don't have that kind of real-world experience. And we've never had a situation where the state was a collective bargaining state and then a right-to-work state and switch back. So we can't do that. However, there are, in fact, plenty of political opinions on these 2 labor market institution, wage floor policies that suggest that the state of Illinois would be better off if there were exceptions to prevailing wage or it were weakened, or perhaps Illinois, like Indiana and Michigan and Iowa, and perhaps soon to be Missouri, were to be a right-to-work state, right? So what we decided to do, which has never been done before, is to do a forecasting study. Why wait until something happens? Let's use the best research we can, let's use the best modeling we can, let's be as conservative as we can, and let's see if we can make a prediction. Could be right, could be wrong, but let's put it out there so that policymakers and all of you can have access to some data as you think about changing the rules of the road. So what we did here at the University of Illinois is we teamed up with some leading researchers, one at Michigan State, who has done a considerable amount of work on prevailing wage, and then one at University of Michigan, who's done a lot of work on right to work. And we teamed up and we put together this forecasting study, okay? And you've got the fact sheets on the table. So that's where we come into this research. So what I'm going to do, you don't have the PowerPoint. If you want it, I have no problem sending it to you, or CISCO can send it to you. You have a fact sheet that summarizes bullet points, right? By the way, if you want the whole policy brief, or you want the full academic paper, because you just love working through appendix and methodologies and footnotes and technical data, you can go to our website, which is illinoislabored.edu. illinoislabored.edu. I have to close my eyes in order to say that. If you go to that website, you can click on Applied Research. The studies are available, you can download them. So if you had the choice, under what set of circumstances would people work? Would you work? Would you want, can you guys see? Would you want your people working? And the argument is, of course, it matters under what conditions you work. This is an interesting, believe it or not, image from a construction site. If there's a huge fuck-up call time. I had to just work that in. I just love my colleagues and helping me put this together said, Bobby, use this image. Go ahead. I dare you to use this image. So I did. So the point is, the rules of the road matter, right? It matters what the rules are. I think Dan talked about it. So let's start with the prevailing wage study. We'll just walk through a couple of findings. So the bottom line is that prevailing wages do not lead to any increases or substantive increase in the cost of public construction projects. And we looked at a lot of other research that was out there, and we tried to apply that to what we would expect in Illinois, and we identify a couple of findings, and then note at the bottom that for the most part, wherever you see cost affected, it's important to account for how the rules change the mix of skilled labor that would then be on the job and its impact on productivity. Most studies overlook that, but the best studies then counterbalance any increase in a cost with the improvements in productivity or changes in the management practices of the contractor. So what we find in predicting what would happen here in Illinois, we're not anticipating any significant or measurable increase in costs that aren't mitigated by improvements in terms of productivity and skilled labor. Now this chart we threw in there because we wanted you to be aware that in states that have strong prevailing wage laws, the percentage of work that's done by in-state contractors, so this should be very important to all of you, is actually higher. And so we anticipate that if you weaken prevailing wage in Illinois, more of the work would then shift to out-of-state contractors. Okay? That's what we have found in other studies, and based on a mix here in Illinois, we project a similar impact. So interesting enough, if you weaken this common construction wage law, we would project a minimum job loss that would have a negative employment effect of roughly 3,300 net jobs, give or take, that the state's overall economy, the GDP, so you run these economic models where you put these variables in and then you see what happens on the outside, that the economy would contract by more than $1 billion. So you'd have An economy in Illinois that's about $1 billion smaller. There would be roughly $44 million in lost state and local taxes. No, I was on Chicago Tonight last night. I don't know if any of you watched. I was talking about the Northwestern football players organizing, which is a fascinating story in itself. But there was a panel of elected state leaders who were all commenting on the state's economy and what needs to be done. And I had a chance to actually chat with some of these folks in the room before we went on the air. And you know, they all but one actually voted to lower my pension. And the one who didn't said he opposed it because he wanted to lower it more. But then they went on air and they began to talk about what they thought they ought to do. You should, you know, do this and this with taxes. You shouldn't raise the minimum wage. And nobody really had an answer for, well, how do you make up for, you know, lost tax revenue if you alter the tax code, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's really important that people think about the hole you kind of blow in the budget when you reduce revenue coming into the state. There would be about $116 million of lost federal taxes, too. Again, this is a forecasting study. All forecasts have some degree of, you know, inaccuracy. You probably can't see this, but it's a list of these sectors in Illinois, the top 20, and what would be the effect on jobs in those industries. So remember, we noted that we anticipated almost 3,300 net jobs lost. You could go through this list from food services down to professional organization, retail stores, and get a sense of what the job loss would be. So quite a few sectors, the top 20 employment sectors here that would be impacted are listed in this table. So we actually looked at where the jobs would be lost, what industries. That's how kind of fine and grained you can do the research. All right, so we go to a third finding. I remember talking to a B&A reporter about this. If you repeal prevailing wage, in about a decade, you're going to kill 70 Illinois construction workers who wouldn't have otherwise died. You're going to kill about 70 more that wouldn't have otherwise died. This is over a 10-year period, so we were estimating between 7 and 8 deaths, additional deaths. So there is this significant impact on health and safety. This chart, which I think should be pretty visible, the strong prevailing wage state, which would be Illinois, would be that orange, right? You get a sense of the fatal injury rate per 100,000 worker on the vertical axis, and then horizontal, and then the other colored lines deal with states that had prevailing wage at one point or not. And what you can see is that states that are strong prevailing wage states, the incidences of fatalities. Now, what is low? Why fatalities? Well, we only looked at fatalities because, quite frankly, you can't hide somebody dying on a job, but injuries, you know, can be a little fungible, particularly in non-union, non-prevailing states. It's hard to, we feel, though, that likely if you were to assess all injuries, these numbers would be even more dramatic. But it's hard to definitively say that account for all injuries, but you can with fatalities. So you repeal prevailing wage, the employer contributions to worker benefits would dramatically decline. I had one employer said, so what's wrong with that, Professor? Well, dollars spent per employee in construction sectors, and this is in the United States. We looked at non-prevailing wage states, an average, we looked at prevailing wage states, an average, and then we pulled Illinois out. The green is the per employee spent on fringe benefits. The blue is per employee spent on legally required benefits. You get a sense of the importance of the contribution. And of course, this has to do with quality of life. It has to do with generating economic demand in the marketplace. It has to do with taxes paid to a school district. It has to do to sort of keeping the community strong. It has a lot to do with attracting business, because business wants to be where business is happening. So it matters in terms of the benefits, both legally and otherwise, that would be paid. So you can see what the likely loss would be if we repealed prevailing wage, or weakened it in some profound way. There are then two other findings. I don't have charts for this, because I didn't want to bore you for too long this morning. There are nearly twice as many apprenticeships in states with prevailing wage laws as in those without such laws. So if you were to reduce prevailing wage, weaken it in this state, it would have an impact on your apprenticeship programs. It also will have an impact on the mix of people in terms of the diversity. There's no substantial evidence that prevailing wage laws are harmful to African American participation in the construction industry. There may be other reasons, but it's not prevailing wage that's doing that. All right, so I'm going to transition here. There's certainly more in the numbers and in the data, but we're going to transition to right to work, okay? We're doing good? Yank me out, Gary. So what happens if Illinois decides to become a right to work state? Well, kind of getting right to the bottom line, private sector annual earnings would fall by between 5 and 7%. Manufacturing worker earnings would fall by 9%. But nobody's income is going to fall more than the people that make their living in the industries that you put your blood and bone into. Construction worker earnings would fall by 22%, and we're being conservative with our numbers. The union wage premium would fall overall by 2%. Right? Whatever that advantage was, working union would drop by about 2%. Now this chart takes the average worker at $35,000 from 213 to 223, and we do a prediction. If Illinois becomes a right-to-work state, and we compare it to what happens if Illinois remains a strong collective bargaining state, and as you get to the bottom, over 10 years, that worker, that average worker at $35,213 in 10 years has lost over $60,000 in income. Again, nobody's ever done a study like this. They said this is what we anticipate will happen if you go in this direction. So a policymaker, if they want to weaken prevailing wage, or if they want to adopt a right to work provision, they have to explain to you how they justify taking $60,000 out of that worker's pocket in a decade. It's an interesting campaign approach. Right? Again, most studies don't look. They're not forecasting studies. Now, what about right to work's impact on job gains? Now, we're not seeing anything in it. We're not seeing it in Indiana. And we certainly haven't. There's lots of sort of mixed ways of looking at the data in other states. But let's say Illinois adopts right to work. Well, we think the unemployment rate might actually fall from 9.1% to 8.4%. Could happen. By the way, if labor costs very little, lots of employers will hire more people, right? I mean, you could make a case that if we had no minimum wage, hell, labor's zero. I'll hire everybody. So there's no big surprise if you lower labor costs that somebody might actually hire a few additional people. We have to think about the impact on the society if we do that. But the drop that we looked at is temporary. So you have this drop, and then it flattens out. So after 5-7 years, any advantage you had dissipates, and now you're back at the sort of the same employment rate of growth as a collective bargaining state. So you get an immediate bump, a temporary bump, at a much lower rate of pay and benefits, and there are induced effects from all that. But then it flattens out. So when isolated and measured against all the other sort of job creation variables, we don't see that right to work has any sort of sustained, proven record of stimulating economic growth. So if a state is having an oil boom, or it's having a natural gas boom, it doesn't matter whether it's a prevailing wage state, a right to work state, a collective bargaining state, or a slave state. lots of people are going to work, right? It's got nothing to do with the policy. So what happens to union membership? Well, there's nothing clearer. There's nothing more robust and clear and indisputable. The most obvious impact of right to work is union membership goes down. It's the one thing that the National Right to Work Committee and all of its auxiliary spin-off organizations understand. The real impact is that unionization goes down. And no economist on any part of the spectrum debates this. This is the most robust of findings. So Illinois' unionization rate, and again, we're running models and we're giving you a range, would fall from roughly 14.6% to between 4.7, or it would fall more modestly to 13.1. Again, we're trying to be conservative. We're trying to allow for this and that to happen. Imagine Illinois with a unionization rate of 4%. We'd be slightly above North Carolina. Here's another pretty awesome finding. If you were to adopt right to work, the hourly wages of African American workers would fall between 2 and 9%. The people actually most hurt are going to be people near the lower end of the income scale. And actually, non-union workers in Illinois will take the biggest hit, dollar-wise. Hourly wages of women fall by 2 to 8%. And how about this? The hourly wages of, to be perfectly honest with you, just look at the demographics. Illinois' new emerging middle class is going to come to a large extent out of its immigrant Latino population. And the labor movement and the business community and the education all have to sort of wrap their arms around this reality. Well, right to work is likely to reduce their earnings by roughly 8%. So nothing could be more damaging to equality in the United States than adopting a law like this, which suggests it ought to build a really powerful coalition of people around preventing any kind of right to work law. And so this is a chart that just kind of looks at the numbers a little bit and does a comparison between Illinois as a right to work state, Illinois as a collective bargaining state, and it breaks it down. And of course the red is all in the negative range. Again, all of this is in the longer report. So we're almost done. Just like prevailing wage, right to work reduces employee benefits and increases fatalities. If Illinois adopted a right to work law, an additional 170 workers, construction workers, would be killed on the job over a decade. So about, what are we talking? We're about a little more than 10 as a result of right to work, right? Leaving prevailing wage aside. The benefits package offered to construction workers would decline annually by about $4,000. That's if it's just right to work. By the way, it's rare that you pass right to work but also protect prevailing wage. These things go in tandem. And here, similarly to the prevailing wage, you see the chart with the dark blue as the fringe benefit and the light blue as the legally required benefits. And you can see the difference between collective bargaining states and right to work states. Yes. So it's going to have a negative impact on the economy. You've got decreased worker earnings, unionization rate, worker benefits. Just get to the bottom bullet. Tax revenues would decline by about $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. I won't have a pension, right? We'll cut it a little bit more, right? Another way to blow a huge hole in the state's economy. You know, this has nothing to do with prevailing wage. I'm at the end of the slide. I'm trying to be a little creative here. I just saw this ad, and you know, you should think of prevailing wage and right and collective bargaining laws, and you should think of minimum wage laws as all wage floors that are meant to account for all these inefficiencies in a free market that create incentives for unscrupulous employers none in this room, I'm well aware, who would be inclined for their own benefit to underpay for the value of the work that they give. So floors are very important. Think of the floors you build. You can't have a foundation without a strong floor. And the foundation is only as good, and you can only go as high as the strength of the floor. But if you were to undo the floor, then you would create enormous instability and free labor. That's what is in this ad. So I'm trying to make this connection. If you make the labor free, or you make it cheap, you get a weak floor. And we should be putting in floors with cheap labor. See, that's clever, huh? You like that? Anyway, some dynamism in my presentation. And then this, are you really sure that a floor can also be a ceiling? Floors are also ways of signaling stability to employers and to workers and to policymakers. They can give you a sense of what the range is going to be, right? It's a range. We've got a floor, we probably now know where the ceiling is going to be. We have a range. In a sense, the floor, again, helps with the entire artifice. And it's something one climbs. So you can climb from the floor to the heavens. And last, this is a statement from Franklin Roosevelt when the Fair Labor Standards Act and the prevailing wage law was all first being the Davis-Bacon Act, was all being debated and fought over. Do not let any calamity hiring executive with an income of $1,000 a day, which is a lot of money back in 1936, 37, tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry. It wasn't true then. It's not true now, and I think any undercutting of these floors will, in fact, have a rather disastrous effect on certainly Illinois' economy. So with that, we're done, and I'm happy to stick around and get yelled at or dispute, debate, whatever you would like. But thank you so much. You're very kind.